Ever imagine humanity blasting off into space, evolving in totally different ways, and then 10,000 years later, bam, they all come back to Earth to duke it out?
Sounds like a wild sci-fi movie.
It is. Well, sort of. It's actually the backdrop for this really cool digital card game we're diving into today,
Yeah.
Parallel TCG. I got a ton of research on it from you, and let me tell you, it's got way more depth than I expected.
Yeah, Parallel's got some buzz around it, and for good reason. From what I've seen, it's not just about the cards themselves, but the lore, the art, and how they're weaving in blockchain technology. Really unique stuff.
Totally. So before we get into all that, should we give our listeners a quick rundown of what this whole parallel universe is about?
Definitely. Imagine this. Earth, thousands of years in the future, is abandoned. Humanity's scattered across the galaxy, each faction evolving in isolation, adapting to wildly different planets.
And these factions are not just your run-of-the-mill aliens, right? I mean, we're talking descendants of humanity who've evolved in some pretty crazy ways.
Exactly. Like, take the Cathari, for example. They set up shop on Europa, one of Jupiter's moons, a completely icy world. They're all about manipulating water and ice, turning it into weapons and technology. Really cool stuff.
Okay, so 5 factions, each with its own unique history and look. Pretty standard for a TCG, right?
Yeah.
But where Parallel seems to really shine is the actual gameplay.
Yeah, I mean, the core is familiar, right? You build decks with cards from your chosen faction, you got to manage resources, outmaneuver your opponent, but then you add in the Paragon system and it becomes a whole different game.
Paragon system, that's where it gets really interesting. Tell us more about that.
So imagine each of your decks is led by this powerful paragon, right? Think of them like your champions. Each paragon has these game-changing abilities that can turn the tide of battle.
So you're not just strategizing about card combinations, you're factoring in your Paragon's powers, which adds a whole other layer of depth.
Exactly. And if you're someone who loves to really sink their teeth into strategy, Parallel has something for everyone. Ranked ladders, tournaments, you name it, it's got it. Really gets the competitive juices flowing.
And speaking of getting into the game, one thing that really stood out to me was this whole concept of tree ownership.
Ah, yeah, the blockchain element. This is where things get really interesting for the future of gaming, maybe even beyond.
Right. So in Parallel, you don't just collect the cards, you actually own them. Like, really own them.
Big difference from, say, a physical card game, right? It's more like owning a piece of digital art or a rare item in a video game. But here, it's tied to this whole strategic gameplay experience.
Which kind of blurs the line between a game and an investment, right? I mean, some of these cards could be worth something someday.
Potentially, yeah. And that's what some folks are excited about. The tech is still new, but this whole concept of digital ownership could change how we think about collectibles in the future, not just in games.
That's wild. But let's be real, a lot of our listeners are busy people.
Hmm.
We don't all have time to learn complex new games. What about Parallel's accessibility?
Right, so one thing I appreciate is that the developers seem to be very focused on user experience. They're constantly updating the interface, making it intuitive for both newcomers and TCG veterans.
And what about the art style? That's always a big one for me.
They could easily gone with cheap AI-generated stuff, which honestly I'm seeing a lot of these days.
Yeah, and it usually looks pretty generic.
Exactly. But the creators of Parallel, they went all out, handcrafted art on every single card, and you can tell it's gorgeous. Really adds to the whole experience.
Okay, so to wrap things up here for our listeners, we've got a TCG with a rich sci-fi backstory, engaging strategic gameplay, and it's using blockchain tech in a way that gives players real ownership. That's a lot to be excited about.
Absolutely. Parallel is definitely pushing the boundaries of what a TCG can be.
It really makes you wonder,
Yeah.
could this be the start of a whole new era for gaming? Digital ownership, unique collectibles, maybe even new ways to play and interact. What do you think?
Now that's a question worth pondering.
I'll leave our listeners with that thought. Until next time, everyone.